the small, foggy town of Blackwood, where the streets were narrow and the houses leaned against each other like old friends, there lived a peculiar detective named Inspector Horace Gray. He was a man of sharp wit and an uncanny ability to notice the smallest details. One gloomy evening, as the rain tapped gently against his office window, Inspector Gray received a visit from a frantic young woman named Clara Bennett. Clara was trembling as she entered the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Inspector, you must help me. Something terrible has happened at my uncle's house. He's gone missing, and there are footprints on the ceiling." Inspector Gray raised an eyebrow. "Footprints on the ceiling, you say? That is indeed unusual. Tell me more." Clara explained that her uncle, Mr. Albert Bennett, was a retired professor who lived alone in a large old house on the outskirts of town. She had gone to visit him that morning but found the house empty. The front door was unlocked, and inside, everything seemed normal except for the muddy footprints on the ceiling of the study. Intrigued, Inspector Gray grabbed his hat and coat and followed Clara to the Bennett house. The house was a towering, ivy-covered structure with creaky wooden floors and a musty smell. Clara led the inspector to the study, where sure enough, there were clear footprints on the ceiling, as if someone had walked upside down. Inspector Gray examined the room carefully. The furniture was undisturbed, and there were no signs of a struggle. He noticed that the footprints led from the window to the center of the ceiling and then disappeared. He also found a small, muddy mark on the windowsill. "Tell me, Miss Bennett," Inspector Gray asked, "has your uncle been acting strangely lately?" Clara thought for a moment. "Well, he's been spending a lot of time in his study working on some secret project. He wouldn't tell anyone what it was, but he seemed very excited about it." Inspector Gray nodded. "I see. Let's take a closer look at this study." As they searched the room, Inspector Gray noticed a bookshelf that seemed slightly out of place. He pushed it aside and found a hidden door behind it. The door led to a narrow staircase that descended into the basement. In the basement, they found a small laboratory filled with strange contraptions and scientific equipment. In the center of the room was a large machine with wires and tubes connected to it. On a table nearby, there was a journal filled with notes and diagrams. Inspector Gray picked up the journal and began to read. It seemed that Professor Bennett had been working on an invention that could reverse gravity. He had successfully tested it on small objects, but had not yet tried it on a human. The last entry in the journal read, "Tonight, I will attempt the final experiment. If successful, I will be the first man to walk on the ceiling." Clara gasped. "Do you think something went wrong with the experiment?" Inspector Gray nodded. "It seems likely. The footprints on the ceiling suggest that your uncle's invention worked, but something must have happened to him afterward." Just then, they heard a faint noise coming from the corner of the room. Inspector Gray and Clara rushed over and found Professor Bennett lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. He was wearing a strange harness connected to the machine. They quickly called for a doctor, and Professor Bennett was taken to the hospital. When he regained consciousness, he explained that the experiment had worked, but the machine had malfunctioned, causing him to lose control and crash into the ceiling. He had been knocked unconscious and had no memory of what happened afterward. Inspector Gray smiled. "Well, Professor, it seems your invention was a success, albeit a dangerous one. Perhaps you should consider adding a safety mechanism next time." Professor Bennett chuckled weakly. "I suppose you're right, Inspector. Thank you for finding me." As for the footprints on the ceiling, they became a local legend in Blackwood, a reminder of the strange and wonderful things that could happen in the quietest of towns. And Inspector Gray? He returned to his office, satisfied with another mystery solved, and waited for the next curious case to come his way.